Hi everyone. So today I will be presenting results from my dissertation research, and I will show how zooarchaeology, or the study of animal remains that are recovered from archaeological sites, can provide evidence for resilience and resource exploitation at the site of Lamanai in Belize during the colonial period. So the Spanish conquest and the subsequent colonization of the Maya area were a time of turmoil that impacted the social, political, and economic structure of Maya communities. But the colonial process in itself was heterogeneous, and this is a consequence of the geography of the Maya region, combined with strong resistance to Spanish conquest. So by 1545 and until the end of the 17th century, the Yucatan Peninsula could be divided into three zones. There was the thriving Spanish colony in northwest Yucatan, the unpacified territories to the southwest, and a semi-conquered buffer zone that corresponds more or less to modern Belize and the Mexican state of Quintana Roo. And what I find interesting is that the types and levels of Spanish contact and control shaped the experiences of the Maya that lived in these three different zones. And so in this context, I am asking, how did the Maya that lived in the frontier zone organize themselves and their communities under the conditions of Spanish colonialism? I am examining this particular question at the site of Lamanai. So Lamanai is a large Maya center located in northern Belize. The site stretches over 4 kilometers on the western shore of the New River Lagoon, and it covers 6 square kilometers. It was occupied for nearly 3,000 years, starting in the early Preclassic around 1500 BC to the colonial period in the 17th century. And I am interested in the last 200 years or so of that history, a time that is called the terminal post-classic to the early Spanish colonial transition. So during the late post-classic, Lamanai was a prosperous site and a major trading center in northern Belize. It became an encomienda under Spanish control in 1544, but the Spanish never resided at the site on a permanent basis. Interactions with the Spanish at Lamanai are evidenced by 2 Christian churches constructed at the site and a few European objects, but there's not much else. And that's because the Lamaneros, the people of Lamanai, they continued to use the same ceramic, lithics, and architectural types after Spanish conquest. And this is interpreted as evidence for relative stability in indigenous economic and political structures at the site. Lamanai appears to have been abandoned by 1650, barely 100 years after becoming an encomienda. So the faunal material from my project dates to the terminal post-classic to the early colonial period, and the sample comprises about 10,000 vertebrate and invertebrate specimens that were recovered from 4 domestic non-elite house lots, which are the red circles on the slide, as well as 3 elite structures that are likely forming a residential complex inside the blue circle. So I used these zooarchaeological data from these households to examine the extent to which indigenous practices at Lamanai were transformed by or resilient to Spanish colonial policies. But why use animal remains to study this particular question? Well, we know from previous faunal studies that the Maya used animals to express their social and political position within a community, that they exchanged animals through trade networks, and that they used them in ritual performances and sacrifices. And so animal remains in the archaeological record can serve as a proxy for economic, social, and political systems. But what can we expect to find at Lamanai in terms of animal use during the colonial period? So we know that in the conquered zone of northern Yucatan, many Maya communities were forced to abandon their traditional hunting practices in favor of raising European domesticated animals. But Maya communities in the borderlands where Lamanai was located continued to focus on local animal resources, suggesting greater resilience to the imposition of Spanish colonial policies. At Lamanai, I also expect to find continued use of local resources. But I also hypothesize that several factors, like tribute obligations to the Spanish or a population influx, may have stressed existing food production strategies during the colonial period, forcing the Lamaneros to change their food ways. So the first 2 methods that I used to examine change in animal use were taxonomic abundances and diversity indices. These zooarchaeological data indicate a decrease in diversity and equitability of exploited animal taxa from the post-classic to colonial times. And this suggests that even if the Lamaneros continue to exploit a diverse set of resources, they intensified their exploitation of a smaller number of animals. And the taxonomic abundances reveal that the Lamaneros continued to exploit the same taxa, but the focus changed from mammals and freshwater mollusks to freshwater turtles and fishes. And these are species that could be mass captured with nets and traps. With regard to terrestrial resources, deer and turkeys became more abundant, while the importance of dogs declined. This change in animal exploitation was reflected in habitat use. So I conducted a habitat fidelity analysis, and this assigns a value to animals based on the amount of time they spent in different habitats. And these habitat values are then multiplied by the abundance of each animal in the zooarchaeological assemblage. So the habitat fidelity analysis indicates a shift toward greater utilization of rivers, in this case, probably the New River Lagoon and adjacent areas, and also an increase in opportunistic hunting and gardens in agricultural fields over time. So the Lamaneros appear to have relied less heavily on domesticated species that are representative of residential areas after Spanish contact. European domesticated animals like pigs and chickens, they were always rare at Lamanai, suggesting that these animals were not widely used by the community as food. And this pattern contrasts with what was seen at the conquered zone of northern Yucatán, where chicken and pigs were readily accepted by the Maya, or at least imposed on them by the Spanish. I also used carbon and nitrogen isotope analysis to examine husbandry practices at Lamanai. So briefly, the ratio of isotopes of the same kind vary according to what we eat and the ecosystems in which we live. And as we grow, isotopes are ingested in water and food, or incorporated in all body tissues. And so by measuring the ratios of different isotopes in bone and teeth, you can examine the diet of people as well as animals. So here I'm using carbon isotope analysis to determine the types and proportions of plants in an animal's diet. And I'm particularly interested in the consumption of maize, which was the main cultivar for the Maya. And you can see that there were two clusters. So the first cluster on the right are animals with a maize-enriched diet. And so this means that they were most likely intentionally fed by humans, and these animals are dogs and turkeys. And so the result for a dog is obviously not surprising because they lived among human settlements. They could be fed scraps or they could forage on their own. But the data about turkey is what's interesting, because we know from prior studies at Lamanai and others in the Maya area that the Maya raised turkeys. And the results at Lamanai indicate that this practice continued into the colonial period. The second cluster on the left of the slide is formed of wild animals like deer, tapir, and turtles, and they all exhibit a diet expected of herbivores that mainly consumed forest vegetation, or in case of turtles, a river vegetation. It's also been proposed, based on ethnohistoric evidence, that the Maya possibly husbanded deer or that they raised fawns from infancy, but there's no evidence at Lamanai for the husbandry of wild animals. I also analyzed patterns of bone breakage to determine if the Lamaneros engaged in marrow extraction. So marrow extraction is a time-consuming activity, and it can be indicative of food stress. So fractures that are created by marrow extraction are called green bone fractures because they're made when the bone is green or fresh. And you can see that this type of fracture was more abundant in the early colonial deposits than they were before Spanish contact. So overall, these zooarchaeological and isotopic data point to some intensification in the use of animal resources during the early colonial period. The Lamaneros placed their emphasis on animals that could be mass captured, like freshwater turtles and fish, or that could be opportunistically hunted in gardens and agricultural fields, like deer, peccary, and armadillo. And so I also identified an intensification in two practices, which were turkey husbandry and marrow extraction from long bones. So what can explain the push toward resource intensification? Well, it's possible that Spanish tribute requirements placed a burden on the community, although it's pretty difficult to determine what the Lamaneros actually owed in tribute or how often they actually paid tribute, because we actually don't have the historical documentation for Lamanai. But it is interesting that two possible tribute items, turkeys and fish, increased in abundance during the early colonial period, possibly to meet these new demands placed by the Spanish. The Lamanai population was also transformed by forced resettlement efforts by the Spanish. We're pretty certain of that. And so Renju Song has documented at Lamanai that weaning practices were extended and that dietary patterns in children became more heterogeneous during the colonial period. And so in this context, the increase in marrow cracking could suggest that some food insecurity was fulfilled with greater fat intake. The shift in animal use also suggests that less time was invested in animal procurement strategies, and this parallels findings by Darcy Wewell's study of non-elite colonial households at Lamanai. Wewell documented an increase in the presence of one-meal cooking pots during the colonial period, and this coincided with a decline in the more labor-intensive komals that we use for maize food preparation. So overall, what I see is that the changes in animal use during the colonial period were not a radical departure from what the Maya did before Spanish contact. There is change. The change is not dramatic. In fact, following what Kitty Emery has proposed before me for Lamanai, it can be argued that these transformations had their roots in post-classic practices that were already changing before the Spanish even arrived. And even more, by maintaining what could be considered, quotation mark, traditional post-classic foodways, the Lamaneros may have solidified the Mayaness in a time during which their identity was threatened by the new colonial regime and missionization efforts. And so the refocus on the more intensive exploitation of local resources would have provided economic stability to a community that had to rely on itself more than ever before. And this demonstrates resilience of this frontier Maya community that was Lamanai to the important social and political transformations brought about by Spanish colonialism. And this cultural resilience continues today with the people of Belize. And I've been fortunate to work with really wonderful people for the 3 years that I conducted research lab at Lamanai. And what was most impactful for me were the discussions I've had with these people, with the Indian church residents, the tour guides that passed through Lamanai, the staff members of the Lamanai Archaeological Reserve, and the owners of the gift shop at Lamanai. And really, I found it's really easy to engage in conversations about food and animals with people because, well, if you think about it, we all have to eat. And food is something that's very cultural and personal. And what transpired from these conversations is that the way of the past are echoing in the present. The people in Belize, they still raise animals, they still plant, they still fish, and they live in the same environments in which the ancient Maya lived. And let's not forget that there's some Maya that live today in Belize. And so it's been really interesting from these conversations to hear about, for example, how the hicatee, or what we also call the Central American river turtle, is still considered a delicacy today by many. And this is the most common turtle that I found at Lamanai. So you can see a persistence of a preference for a particular turtle over time. Or it's been really nice to be able to talk to people about what I find in the archaeological record, let's say particular species of fish or turtles that are present, and see that, you know, these are still present in the lagoon today and that people would still fish them. And sometimes you also, you know, learn a few things, a few tricks that are interesting, like, you know, being with a tour guide that tells you, like, did you hear this? And like, what are you talking about? Like this, like something sound, that's a peccary. I'm like, oh, okay. And like, well, what do you do if you see a peccary? It's like, well, if you see like a squadron of peccaries, you better climb a tree because that could be dangerous. So it's these conversations that really make you feel that, you know, people are still living here today and there's some, you can still engage with them about the work that you do. But so one of the things that I regret from my PhD is not involving more people, more community members of Indian Church in my research. So I had 2 Indian Church residents actually help me sort through bones in the lab, but I haven't had a chance to do a lot more. And so I had plans before COVID to organize a talk/roundtable in Indian Church because I was hoping to present the results of my dissertation research. And this idea came from conversations that I've had in Spanish with, you know, some of like the people that work at the reserve or that live in Indian Church, where they're like telling me how they know that we carry out research, but they don't really know what we actually discover, and they would be interested in these kind of findings. So it's not impossible for me to do this roundtable. I hope that I can do it in the future, but my current contribution to that is to create a poster that will be hung in the museum at the Lamanai Archaeological Reserve. And this poster will be both in Spanish and in English. So the poster is in development right now, so I can show it to you because it's not completed, but it is my hope that this will help showcase how resilient the Lamaneros were in the face of Spanish colonialism. And it is my first step in mobilizing knowledge in the Indian Church community. And I hope to do much more in the future. I would like to thank all of these people and organizations for the support and the funding. And thank you.